Welcome back to the Psyche and Singularity series. I'll be going over my book, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. This video is an added addition to the Psyche and Singularity series because of Tulsi Gabbard's rise. She was the most Googled candidate in the primary debates among the Democratic Party of the candidates running for president in 2020. And she is a member of the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, or the Hare Krishna school of Vedanta. And so there was some controversy over her religious background. I saw this moment in history as a good time to explain to those people who are interested in what her religious beliefs are, and to tie that into my book, Psyche and Singularity. At the concluding video for the series, Psyche and Singularity, I said that the next series will be about politics, and I've already put up a couple of papers on academia.edu entitled E Pluribus Unus Mundus, where I talk about how we should update the Constitution by defining the self as the gravitational singularity and its surrounding horizon. So I'll talk about that later, but first I'm going to describe the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta, to which Tulsi Gabbard subscribes. So I already talked about that in a previous episode of this series. It is discussed in chapter 3 of the book, Philosophical Precedents for the Jung Susskind Synthesis, and it begins with the Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta Cosmology. So very briefly, the idea is it's a theistic form of the Vedanta school. Tulsi Gabbard says she's the first Hindu candidate for the presidency, but Hindu is a controversial word among Hindus. It's not written in the Vedic scriptures, so it's more accurate to as Tulsi Gabbard does. She says, I'm a member of the Gaudiya Vaishnava. So Gaudiya Vaishnavism was founded by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu about 500 years ago in Gauda, which is now called Bengal. So Bengali Vaishnavism, Chaitanya Vaishnavism, but the more popular name is the Hare Krishnas. So in 1965, a man named A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada brought this Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition from India to the United States of America, and he founded the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And you can read an article in the New Yorker, which is a good summary. October 30th, 2017, Khalifa Sine, I hope that's the proper pronunciation, wrote this article. And in this article, it talks about in 1965, an elderly Indian man known as A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada arrived in America and soon began singing and preaching in Tompkins Square Park in New York's East Village. So in 1971, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada brought the Hare Krishnas to Hawaii, and that is where Chris Butler met Srila Prabhupada. When I say Srila Prabhupada, I'm referring to A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And so Chris Butler was initiated as Siddha Swarupananda, and Tulsi Gabbard is associated with him. So his sub-branch of the Hare Krishnas is a controversial group of people in Hawaii. It seems to me that Tulsi Gabbard focuses more attention on A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. So if you want to know about what her religious beliefs are, it would be safest to read his books, specifically the Bhagavad Gita as it is. So Tulsi, when she became a congresswoman, she took her oath of office on the Bhagavad Gita. I'm assuming it was Srila Prabhupada's translation. And so with that, I will read from that translation to give an important understanding of the cosmology. So I'll be focusing mainly on the Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology, which I'll then compare to the Carl Jung, Leonard Susskind synthesis, which is the focus of my book. So here is from the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita as it is by Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He says, in the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the real picture of the material world is given. The Supreme Lord said, so this is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, there is a banyan tree which has its roots upward and its branches down, and the Vedic hymns are its leaves. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas. So the purport is we have experience of a tree whose roots are upward. If one stands on the bank of a river or any reservoir of water, he can see that the trees reflected in the water are upside down. The branches go downward and the roots go upward. Similarly, this material world is a reflection of the spiritual world. The material world is but a shadow of reality. So the material world is the inverted reflection of the spiritual world. So that would imply that the material atoms, if you break it down to first principles, are reflections of the spiritual atoms, which would imply that the laws of physics are reflections of the laws of the psyche or psychology. And we do see a very pronounced parallel between the spiritual cosmology of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas and holographic string theory, which is the union of quantum mechanics and general relativity. I'll talk, if you've been watching this series, this is old stuff, but for a lot of people, I'm assuming they might be more interested in Tulsi Gabbard. So I will explain that a little bit later on, but first things first, I'm going to describe this Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology. So this world is the inverted reflection of the spiritual world. Here's the big picture for the Hare Krishna cosmology. So Hare Krishna. Krishna is the name of, according to this specific branch of Vishnu worshipping Vedanta cosmology, Krishna is the original Vishnu. Vishnu is another name for God, the omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, omnibenevolent Godhead, the supreme personality of Godhead, to use Srila Prabhupada's phrase. Krishna is the original Vishnu. Other schools of Vishnu worshippers might emphasize another form of Vishnu, but in this school to which Tulsi Gabbard subscribes, Krishna is the original Vishnu. And every Vishnu form has a female counterpart, Lakshmi. So the original Vishnu is Krishna, and the original Lakshmi is Radharani. And they live together on a spiritual planet called Goloka Vrindavan. Vrindavan, spelt with a V. Tulsi Gabbard's sister is Vrindavan Gabbard. She's named after this eternal spiritual planet, Vrindavan, which has a spiritual embassy on planet Earth in India in a town called Vrindavan, where Krishna incarnated 5,000 years ago, according to this Gaudiya Vaishnava religion. So in the spiritual world, of which this material world is the inverted reflection, Goloka Vrindavan is the centralmost spiritual planet, which radiates the effulgence of Brahman. So there's two sides of reality in this cosmology, Atman and Brahman. Atman is the name for the individual, personal, particular self or soul, and Brahman is the waves of impersonal precognitive bliss, the potential for a Atman to be perceived. Atman and Brahman is very similar to the particle wave paradox of quantum mechanics. According to quantum mechanics, as discovered by the two-slit experiment, if you observe a quantum particle, it behaves just like a little particle. But if you're not observing it, it behaves like a wave of probability for where a particle might appear were it to be observed. So, according to this cosmology, each of us is an eternal individual personal soul, Atman. At the same time, we're inconceivably, simultaneously merged with everyone else in the impersonal Brahman, which led to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's phrase, Achintya Beta Beta Tattva, inconceivably, simultaneously one and different. In the school of Buddhism, rejects the individual eternal self, Atman. It's the philosophy of no Atman, Anatman. So Chaitanya school of Vedanta says, well, yes, it's true. There is an impersonal aspect of reality, but somehow, inconceivably, beyond the ability of a human mind to conceive, there is also the personal side, Atman, and both are true. They are mutually exclusive but complementary facets of reality. And it's inconceivable how it can be that way, but that's the way it is. And I think most quantum physicists would say the same thing about the particle wave paradox of quantum mechanics. It's just the way it is. How is it? How can waves of probability become particles when you observe them? And nobody knows. That's just the way it is. So we have a close mirror reflection in that wave particle paradox and the Atman Brahman paradox of Vedanta cosmology. So going back to the big picture, according to this cosmology, there's innumerable spiritual planets. Goloka Vrindavan is the centralmost one, but every other Vishnu form and Vishnu Lakshmi pair, like Sita Ram and every other pair of Vishnu and Lakshmi, they all have their own planet. And each planet is populated by an ecosystem in which every individual form of every species is fully God conscious and filled with bliss. And each of those planets radiates the spiritual light known as the Brahma Jyoti or Brahman. So occasionally an ocean called the causal ocean coagulates in the expansive sky of Brahman, and a form of Vishnu, Karanodakashayi Vishnu, also known as Mahavishnu, descends from the spiritual world, lays down on this causal ocean and goes to sleep and begins to dream. Yoga Nidra is the dreaming potency of Vishnu. And then from the pores of this Mahavishnu's body exhale all the innumerable bubble universes, the material universes. Innumerable bubble universes in this causal ocean are exhaling from Mahavishnu, and then after an enormous amount of time, he re-inhales them, reabsorbs them, and then wakes up, and then goes back to the spiritual world, and then material world has to wait till Mahavishnu goes to sleep again. So Mahavishnu goes to sleep, all of the universes exhale from his body like little bubbles. In the center of every little bubble universe is another form of Vishnu, Garbhodakashayi Vishnu. And from the navel of that form of Vishnu, a lotus flower blossoms. The demigod Brahma is born on the top of that lotus flower, and then that demigod engineers the planets in the stalk of the lotus flower. So each of these bubble universes has 8 concentric spheres, and they are the elements: earth, water, air, fire, ether, and then there's 3 more: mind, intelligence, and false ego. So the big correlation with holographic string theory and Carl Jung's near-death experience is that all of the information that describes the past, the present, and the future of the universe is interwoven at the outermost sphere by a fundamental thread and projected in from that outermost sphere to create this holographic movie, which the Vaishnava Vedanta cosmology calls Maya. 3-dimensional space unfolding through linear time is called Maya, or illusion. It's the dream of Vishnu. And for holographic string theory, it is the holographic movie. The past, present, and future are smeared out on the encompassing horizon of the cosmos where space-time is expanding at the speed of light, and they radiate back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation on fundamental threads of energy to create this holographic illusion. So it's very similar to the Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology. So I will read. This is from the Bhagavad Gita. So Krishna says, this is chapter 7.2 through 8. He says, everything rests upon me as pearls are strung on a thread. I am the sound in ether and ability in man. Later, Krishna says, I am the self, O Gudakesha, seated in the hearts of all creatures. I am the beginning, the middle, and the end of all beings. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says he's the original self, he's the beginning, the middle, and the end, and he's this fundamental string. Everything rests upon me as pearls on a thread. So now I'm going to go to another Vishnu-centric text, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where they really get into this idea of information conservation at the outermost sphere of the universe. So Udalaka Aruni asks Patanjalakapya, do you know the string on which this world and the next, as well as all beings, are strung together? He says, do you know the inner controller of this world and the next, as well as of all beings, who controls them from within? Concluding, he says, if a man knows what that string is and who that inner controller is, he knows Brahman, he knows the worlds, he knows the gods, he knows the Vedas, he knows the spirits, he knows the self, he knows all. So then later, Jagyavalkya talks about the Akasha, which is the word for ether. So there's earth, water, fire, air, and then ether. Each of these concentric spheres of the universe is 10 times thicker than the other, which is similar to the idea of the exponential expansion of space-time according to general relativity and string theory, which combines general relativity with quantum mechanics. So some of the Vedic texts talk about only 5 spheres: earth, water, air, fire, and ether, and some add 3 more: mind, intelligence, and false ego. So whether it's called and the ether is called Akasha. So you might have heard the Akashic record. The Akasha is the ether. That's where the past, the present, and the future are conserved. The Akasha is the intermediary sphere between the grosser physical elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and then the subtle material energy of mind, intelligence, and false ego. That's the material universes. So the main point is this concept of information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. So going back to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, this is what Jagyavalkya says about the ether, or Akasha, which is translated as space. So the things above the sky, the things below the earth, and the things between the earth and the sky, as well as all those things people here refer to as past, present, and future, on space, Gargi, are all these woven back and forth. And then he goes on to say, pitiful is the man, Gargi, who departs from this world without knowing this imperishable Akshara, which is the personified name for the Akasha. Besides this imperishable, there is no one that sees, no one that hears, no one that thinks, and no one that perceives. On this very imperishable Gargi space, Akasha is woven back and forth. So that is the main parallel with holographic string theory. I will read a little bit here from the end notes to this chapter on the Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology. And this is from an anthology called The Hare Krishna Movement. And this article is by Graham Schweg. It's entitled The Intimate Deity. But I just like the way he categorizes the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta. So he says here, Vaishnavism is indeed a theistic tradition, but could be further characterized as a polymorphic monotheism, a theology that recognizes many forms, ananta rupa, of the one single unitary divinity. The power of God is expressed in this Vaishnava metaphysics as the capacity to be in many places and appear in a variety of forms at the same time without being diminished in any way. Another aspect of this theology pushes our characterization closer to a polymorphic bi-monotheism, or many forms of the dual-gendered divinity. The Godhead is essentially androgynous, comprised of both supreme masculine and feminine aspects. So that's the Vishnu and Lakshmi, the male and female sides of the divine being. So that's the basics of the Hare Krishna cosmology, the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, or disciplic succession, leading back to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in India about 500 years ago. So now I'm going to compare that to the idea of psyche equals singularity. So the whole book Psyche and Singularity got started when I was watching Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, and it was the episode, this was the 4th of July, 2010, and it was an episode featuring Leonard Susskind, who was a Stanford string theorist, and his book that he had just put out was The Black Hole. Well, he hadn't just put that one out, but one of his books is The Black Hole War, My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics. I forget if that's the exact subtitle, but that is The Black Hole War is the book, and he was describing how he defeated Stephen Hawking's former claim that black holes erase information from the universe. What he says is the information is actually conserved on the event horizon. Although if you follow something past the event horizon of a black hole, you and that information from your perspective are gone. You can't get back out of the faster than light tidal flow of space-time past the event horizon. You can't even send a signal out faster than light from that inward tidal flow. And the Leonard Susskind's idea of the universe is an inside-out black hole. Just like a black hole is contracting toward a gravitational singularity, a point of infinite density, so is the universe an inside-out black hole because it's expanding from a gravitational singularity at the Big Bang. And space is not only expanding, it's expanding at an exponential rate, and where it reaches the speed of light, that's like an inside-out event horizon. All of the information within the universe is conserved at this outermost sphere. That's the final implication of the theory, and it radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation on these fundamental threads. So when I saw that, it made me remember Carl Jung's near-death experience in 1944. From his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he said he broke his foot, then he had a heart attack, and then he said it felt as if his consciousness rose above his body, above the hospital in Switzerland. He could look down and see things from an aerial perspective. He kept rising until he was 1,000 miles above the earth. He could look down and see the clouds and the reddish sands of Arabia, the continents. That's where he saw an enormous boulder hollowed out into a temple. Inside the temple, which was well lit, at the front entrance hall sat a black Hindu in a white robe. And in the back of the temple, he felt as if the people to whom he belonged in reality were there. And the ultimate insight he gained from this near-death experience was it seemed to him when he came back to his body, which was a horrible experience, that it seemed as if the past, the present, and the future are recorded at the horizon of the cosmos, in his own words, and that each of us is hung up to that horizon by a thread in a little prison box of illusion of three-dimensional space. That three-dimensional space is like a little prison, and we each live in our own little cubic illusion, which is tethered to the horizon of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and the future can be experienced blissfully. So Leonard Susskind is an atheist. He does not believe consciousness is conserved at the horizon of the cosmos. Just the information that describes all of the physical interactions in the three-dimensional volume of the universe is conserved there. But when you see these parallels, then it's good, it gives you good evidence to believe ultimately that each of us, each psyche, is a gravitational singularity or participates in the omnipresent or omnicentric singularity. So Carl Jung worked with one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics, Wolfgang Pauli, for over 25 years to develop a theory of a mirror symmetry or parallels between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics. And the theory is that mind and matter both emerge from the same transcendental source, which they call the unus mundus, also known as the archetype of the self, the God archetype, and the one. Because mind and matter emerge from the same source, the laws of psychology or the laws of the mind should parallel the laws of physics or the laws of matter. So Carl Jung was the best psychologist of his time, in many people's opinion, and Wolfgang Pauli was certainly one of the best theoretical physicists of his time, including Leonard Susskind, that's his opinion. He also agrees with that. So they were looking for these parallels. Another thing that Carl Jung said that is that the greatest insight of his life was realizing that the mandala is the psychic image that arises from the ultimate archetype of the self. So this is Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious mind. So I'll back up a little bit before I talk about the mandala image of the archetype of the self and just talk a little bit about his overall theory of the collective unconscious mind. So Carl Jung worked with Sigmund Freud, and Freud was trying to get Jung to be his successor. Freud came up with the idea of the personal unconscious mind. We have a conscious mind and we have an unconscious mind, or a subconscious mind, where we repress things that are not pleasant for society, our violent impulses, our sexual impulses, all of these unconscious instinctual desires which have to be tamed for civil society to exist. We repress them into our unconscious mind, and then they play havoc on our conscious mind if they're not addressed properly. So Carl Jung said, deeper than the personal unconscious mind, which he agreed exists, is a collective unconscious mind, where the archetypes of perception reside. And his understanding of the archetypes evolved over time. They eventually became not only the lenses of perception, but the sources of existence itself. So each of us participates in this collective unconscious mind, which is populated by these archetypes of perception and their correlated patterns of instinctual behavior. So, for example, every man has an archetypal image of a woman, according to Carl Jung's theory. And when your archetypal image resonates with some actual woman, if you're a man out there in the material world, it will trigger an instinctive response of attraction. And vice versa for women. If they have an archetypal image of a man and it resonates with some man in the material world, then there'll be this instinctive response. So this is just an example of how the archetypes work. And everything that you can perceive is perceived through one of these collective unconscious archetypes. All of the archetypes are contained in and radiate from the ultimate archetype of the self, or the unus mundus. Now, you can't perceive, according to Carl Jung, the archetypes directly because they are the lenses of perception themselves, just like you can't see your own eyes directly because you're perceiving through them. A lot of times people will be looking for their glasses and they can't find them because they're wearing them. So you can't see something in your field of vision if the thing you're looking for is the source of the field of vision, but you can perceive the psychic images that arise from these imperceptible archetypes, says Carl Jung. And the psychic image that arises from the archetype of the self is the mandala, a circle or a sphere with a central point. That throughout the ages, in all of the nations of the world, introspective people, when they're pulled by opposing demands, and that's an important point for Carl Jung's theory, this ultimate archetype tries to compensate the conscious ego that's being pulled by opposing demands with the unifying images of mandalas, which lead the ego, the consciousness, back to this ultimate archetype of unity through the union of opposites, which is the unus mundus, the archetype of the self, or the God archetype. So, in the book Psyche and Singularity, I say, well, if mind and matter are rooted in the archetype of the self, and if the psyche perceives these mental images of mandalas radiating from the archetype of the self, what is the material counterpart of these mandala images? And the answer is a black hole. A black hole is a perfect mandala. It's a dimensionless point, a singularity in the center of a two-dimensional sphere, which is the outer covering of a three-dimensional ball. So black holes are nature's perfect mandalas, and they are the mere symmetric complements of the psychic mandala images that arise in the mind from the archetype of the self. And I relate that idea of this mandala parallel between the psychic mandala images and black holes, understanding that the universe is an inside-out black hole. And then I compare that to an equation that Carl Jung wrote, which I call the leap day equation. It was February 29th, 1952. He concluded a letter where he was comparing psychic energy. He was analyzing psychic energy in the context of general relativity. And he concluded the letter by saying, Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So if Psyche has energy, then it must be equivalent to mass, according to E equals mc squared. This was part of Jung's theory. How come we can't measure psychic energy? Well, he says maybe we can't measure it because it's infinite. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. The highest intensity is infinite density of energy, and the smallest space is zero volume. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So I translate that equation into Psyche equals singularity, and the singularity includes its horizon, forming a mandala. So the archetype of the self I am equating with the gravitational singularity, which is outside of space and time, but it contains all space and time, not only in the centralmost point, but at each point of its encompassing sphere. That's the general gist of the whole book. So now I'm bringing this back to Tulsi Gabbard, and she's claiming that this is her cosmology, this idea of the megaverse of universes, in the center of which is a Vishnu form, Garbhodagashi Vishnu, an infinitely powerful, omniscient being, is not extended in material space. So any form of Vishnu is equivalent to the gravitational singularity in the respect that it's all-powerful, all-knowing, which is parallel to the information conservation, and omnipresent. The Catholic theologian Blaise Pascal, theologian and mathematician, he said, do you think it's impossible, in his collection of aphorisms called Pensees, or thoughts, in aphorism number 420, he says, do you think it's impossible for God to be omnipresent and yet indivisible? If something is spread everywhere, you can divide it, or at least you can imagine dividing it. And then Pascal says, very well, I'll show you something that's omnipresent and indivisible, a single point traveling everywhere infinitely fast. Because it will be at each point simultaneously, an infinitely increasing number of times simultaneously, and yet you can't divide it because it's a point. It has no extension in space. So this Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology is the close of all the world's religions. Again, it's the closest mirror image of holographic string theory, which is the culmination of 20th century physics. From Einstein's special theory of relativity, to the general theory of relativity, to quantum mechanics, to the synthesis of those opposing languages of physics in holographic string theory. And that this very close parallel is strong evidence, according to Carl Jung and Wolfgang Paul's theory, that holographic string theory and the Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology are emerging from the same ultimate archetype of the self, or the God archetype, or the unus mundus. So in the next series, and this is a kind of a transitional series from the Psyche and Singularity series to the E pluribus unus mundus series, I'll be talking about how do we take this idea, this new and oldest concept of the self as the central point of the universe and the encompassing horizon. How do we apply that to politics in a way that can unite the left and the right? Because, according to Carl Jung, whenever a psyche is pulled horribly by the tension of opposing demands, of valid demands, both of which demand to be satisfied, but they are seemingly opposite. How does the psyche deal with that? Well, when a psyche is suffering from this extreme tension, the archetype of the self will compensate that ego with mandala imagery. According to Carl Jung, society follows the same laws of psychology as each individual. So the United States of America being pulled between the left and the right. And in the Democratic Party, you see the same thing. There's a left-wing branch of the Democratic Party. The Democrats lean left anyway, but of that left-leaning party, there is a far left in comparison to whom there's a more right-leaning group. And then there's the overall tension between the Democrats and the Republicans who lean right. There's a far right, and then there's a more moderate leaning to the left side of the Republicans. In both parties, they're pulled by opposing demands, and both parties themselves are pulling the American psyche apart. We should expect, according to Carl Jung, compensatory mandala imagery. I'm saying that is reemerging in holographic string theory, and the way we can see parallels between that and Carl Jung's psychology and the Gaudiya Vaishnava cosmology, which is the oldest. Well, it was 500 years ago with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but it's rooted in these ancient Vedic texts. So the newest cosmology, which is emerging with holographic string theory, I'm saying, is just the latest iteration of the most ancient cosmology, which is this Vedic cosmology. And I just see the fact that Tulsi Gabbard, out of relative obscurity, has become the most Googled candidate, and there's a lot of interest in her Hare Krishna associations. I'd like to see the national conversation focus on that cosmology and that definition of the self. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, this is the preamble to the Constitution. What is a person? If you're talking about we, the people, it would seem wise to first define your most fundamental term, a person or a self. And I'm saying psyche equals singularity. And upon that cosmologically embedded understanding of the self, I think we have a much better chance of reuniting the left and the right by focusing on this ultimate archetype of the union of unity through the union of opposites. So that'll be enough. The next series will be the E Pluribus Unus Mundus series.